At breakfast, my 4-year-old asked a question that made my heart stop. The morning sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, brushing the wooden table with a warm, golden glow. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint sweetness of toast, creating that comforting aroma of a family breakfast. Our 4-year-old son babbled excitedly, a bright grin on his small face, completely absorbed in the cereal he was trying to eat without spilling it all over his little hands. His laughter, light and infectious, filled the room and brought a sense of calm that contrasted sharply with the subtle unease I felt under my skin. My wife sat across from me, stirring her tea with delicate, measured movements. Her posture was elegant as always, but something was different this morning. I noticed the way she hesitated before answering my son's questions, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was almost imperceptible, but in the quiet intimacy of the kitchen, I noticed everything. The little things, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed lightly against the rim of her cup, the occasional glance away as if collecting her thoughts before speaking, spoke volumes. I tried to focus on my son, letting his energy wash over me. He was at that perfect age where curiosity and innocence collided in the most chaotic yet adorable ways. He reached across the table for the butter, knocking over a spoon in the process, and giggled when it clattered onto the floor. I couldn't help but chuckle too, but a small part of me remained alert, scanning my wife's expressions. There was a subtle shift in her energy today, something I couldn't immediately name. As I poured a little more coffee into my mug, I reflected on how ordinary mornings like this were the ones I cherished most, moments when nothing felt urgent, when life felt simple and warm. And yet, beneath that surface calm, I sensed the first ripples of attention I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. It wasn't dramatic or overt. There were no raised voices, no arguments. Just a quiet hesitance in the way she moved, a softness in her laughter that seemed slightly forced, and a distant look in her eyes that made me wonder what thoughts she was keeping to herself. I watched her brush a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her hand lingering for just a moment on the table near mine. There was comfort in that touch, subtle as it was, but it also made me feel slightly disconnected, as if she were both here and elsewhere at the same time. I realized then that this morning, while ordinary on the surface, held a promise of something more, questions unasked, feelings unspoken, and a gentle tension that would soon pull our seemingly simple breakfast into something more profound. In that moment, as sunlight warmed the kitchen and my son's laughter danced in the air, I understood that ordinary mornings could sometimes be the quietest stages for the most unexpected storms. And as I took a sip of my coffee, I felt a strange mixture of comfort, curiosity, and the faintest flicker of unease, a feeling that would grow in ways I didn't yet understand, all beginning at the breakfast table. Breakfast had settled into a gentle rhythm. The clinking of spoons against bowls, the soft hum of the morning outside, and the occasional laugh from our son created a peaceful bubble around the table. Yet, beneath that calm, I could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet tension that had begun to stir the moment my eyes met my wife's fleeting expressions. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself that maybe it was just the way she always had mornings, precise, careful, a little distant until her coffee kicked in. Then it happened. My son, mid-bite, looked up at my wife with wide, curious eyes and asked the question that would change the rhythm of our morning, "Mommy, when is that funny uncle coming over?" Time seemed to slow for a fraction of a second. The words were innocent, almost childlike, but they carried a weight I wasn't ready to process. My wife's hand froze mid-air, her fingers hovering above her mug. A flicker of surprise crossed her face before she forced a small, polite smile. I noticed her inhale just a little too deeply, as if buying herself a moment to collect her thoughts. The pause stretched uncomfortably. Our son, oblivious to the subtle tension he had sparked, continued to play with his spoon, making little tapping noises on the edge of his bowl. His laughter bubbled up again, bright and carefree, completely at odds with the quiet unease that now filled the space between my wife and me. I tried to keep my own expression neutral, but inside, my mind raced. Funny uncle. Who was he? How long had this been on my wife's mind? Was it someone from her past? My heart thumped faster than it should have for a morning like this. I realized how much I depended on these small, ordinary moments for stability, and suddenly, they felt fragile. My wife's eyes finally met mine, and in that brief glance, I saw a mixture of surprise, hesitation, and something softer, almost tender, but also a hint of guilt. I could feel the subtle tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her mug. She opened her mouth to answer, then paused again, as though choosing her words carefully to shield both herself and the delicate innocence of our son. I watched every tiny movement, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the gentle tilt of her head, the quiet clench of her jaw. Each gesture seemed loaded with meaning, and I realized how much I wanted to understand without overstepping, to reach out without alarming her. The child, unaware of the undercurrents, smiled and licked his cereal-covered fingers, blissfully innocent. In that moment, the ordinary breakfast transformed. The room still smelled of coffee and warm toast, sunlight still spilled across the table, but everything felt sharper, more poignant. A simple question from a child had opened a doorway to emotions unspoken, curiosities unexplored, and a subtle tension that would thread its way through the rest of our morning. I took a slow breath, meeting my wife's gaze again, silently telling her that I was here, that I would listen, that I wouldn't jump to conclusions. And in that quiet, fragile understanding, I realized the first step towards something deeper, an unspoken promise that whatever this funny uncle meant, we would navigate it together. The breakfast had ended, but the atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted. Our son, his curiosity satisfied for the moment, had wandered off to play with his toys in the living room, his small footsteps pattering softly across the wooden floor. The air was quiet, punctuated only by the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of a dish being put away. But in that quiet, I felt the weight of unspoken questions pressing between my wife and me. She moved with her usual grace, but there was a subtle hesitation in her gestures. She reached for the sugar, paused, and then set it down again without touching it. Her eyes, usually so open and confident, flickered with something I couldn't immediately name, an emotion both tender and uneasy. I sipped my coffee slowly, trying to steady the mix of curiosity and unease that churned in my chest. My senses seemed to sharpen, catching every small movement, every micro-expression that might reveal what she was thinking. I noticed how her fingers lingered on the edge of the table, as if drawing strength from its familiar solidity. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and when she laughed softly at a memory she seemed to recall mid-thought, it felt more like a delicate shield than true amusement. I realized that this morning, so ordinary in appearance, was layered with subtle tension. I felt a quiet ache of anticipation, the kind that comes from not knowing, from watching someone you love navigate emotions they haven't yet shared. As I reached for my cup, our hands brushed slightly. The touch was fleeting but electric in its subtlety, a spark of connection in the midst of quiet uncertainty. She didn't pull away, but neither did she linger. It was a moment of hesitation, a physical manifestation of the unspoken words that hovered between us. I wanted to reach out more, to close the distance, but I hesitated, respecting the delicate balance of space and intimacy. I found myself observing the small, human details, how she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way her gaze occasionally drifted toward the window, catching the morning light in a way that softened her expression. Each movement seemed deliberate yet fragile, a reflection of an internal struggle she wasn't ready to voice. I wondered what thoughts ran through her mind, and if they included me, if they included us, or if they were entirely her own. The quiet stretched, and in that stillness, I realized how much we rely on these unspoken moments to communicate the emotions that words often fail to capture. I wanted to ask, to probe gently, but I also understood the importance of patience. The child's innocent question had cracked open a door, and now it was my role to watch, to listen, and to be present without forcing an answer. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of the sunlight and the familiar scent of coffee ground me, while my mind quietly traced the tension in her posture, the subtle tremor in her hands, and the fleeting softness in her eyes. In that ordinary morning, I recognized the extraordinary complexity of our connection, the quiet hesitations, the small gestures, and the invisible threads of emotion that tied us together. And I knew that the answers wouldn't come all at once, but would unfold gradually, like the morning itself, one delicate moment at a time. Later that day, after the echoes of our son's laughter had faded into the quiet hum of afternoon, I found a moment to speak with my wife alone. Our son was napping upstairs, the gentle rhythm of his breathing filling the house with a calm serenity that contrasted sharply with the subtle tension lingering between us. I poured us each a cup of tea, the steam curling into the sunlight that fell through the half-open kitchen window. The air was fragrant with the faint scent of jasmine from the garden outside, and I felt the world soften around us, safe, quiet, intimate. She sat at the table, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug, eyes fixed on the swirls of steam rising into the air. I took a careful breath, feeling a mixture of curiosity, concern, and a quiet tenderness for her that had nothing to do with the morning's unease. "Can we talk about what our son asked this morning?" I began gently, my voice steady but warm, avoiding any hint of accusation. Her hands tensed slightly around the mug, a subtle quiver betraying the vulnerability she tried to mask with her composed demeanor. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let her gaze drift toward the window, watching the branches sway in the soft breeze. I watched her closely, the way her shoulders shifted, the gentle sigh she let out, the slight tightening around her jaw. Every small gesture spoke volumes, and I waited patiently, giving her the space to gather herself. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady, tinged with a mix of hesitation and honesty. I didn't expect him to ask that," she admitted, looking down at her tea. "And I guess I didn't realize how much it would make me think about things I've kept tucked away." There was a pause, a soft exhale, and then she met my eyes. "It's not what you think. He's just someone from my past, a friend, really." But hearing my son mention him, it brought up feelings I hadn't expected to feel again. Her words were carefully chosen, measured, but beneath them I sensed a subtle, unguarded vulnerability. I leaned forward slightly, letting my hand brush against hers across the table, a silent reassurance that I was here, ready to listen without judgment. She didn't pull away, and I felt the tension in her fingers ease, replaced by a tentative connection that was more powerful than any words could convey. We talked for a while, quietly, carefully. She shared small memories, glimpses into her past, without pressure or pretense. I listened, not with suspicion, but with curiosity and empathy, appreciating her honesty and the courage it took to open up. In those moments, the ordinary rhythm of our kitchen, the warmth of the sunlight, the soft hum of life outside, the comforting aroma of tea, became a backdrop for something deeper, a fragile intimacy, built not from passion or drama, but from trust, patience, and mutual care. By the time our son stirred upstairs, the conversation had shifted something between us. There was relief, yes, but also a subtle warmth, a quiet acknowledgement that we could face uncertainty together. The lingering tension from breakfast hadn't vanished entirely, but it had transformed into understanding, a shared moment of vulnerability that would strengthen our connection in the days to come. Later that afternoon, after our private conversation had ended and the soft afternoon light had begun to fade into golden hues, I found myself alone in the park near our home. The gentle crunch of gravel beneath my shoes and the distant laughter of children playing on swings created a soothing rhythm, yet my mind felt anything but calm. I walked slowly, letting the crisp air fill my lungs, trying to make sense of the morning's events and the quiet, vulnerable words my wife had shared. I watched my son run ahead, small legs pumping as he chased after a colorful ball. He didn't notice me at first, absorbed entirely in the joy of the moment. The sight brought a bittersweet pang to my chest, reminding me of the innocence that framed our family life, yet also highlighting the subtle complexities that adults carry behind the scenes. I couldn't help but think of my wife, her quiet hesitations, the way her fingers had lingered on my hand during our conversation. As I walked, I replayed the breakfast table in my mind. The question my son had asked, so simple, so innocent, had cracked open a door to emotions I hadn't expected to confront. I realized that the unease I felt wasn't about jealousy or suspicion, but about curiosity, about wanting to understand her completely without disturbing the delicate balance of our family. I felt protective, yes, but also deeply respectful of her privacy, aware that some feelings need space to unfold before they can be shared. The sunlight filtered through the leaves of the trees, casting dappled patterns on the path, and I noticed the way the wind teased strands of my hair across my forehead. Nature's calmness contrasted sharply with the whirlwind of thoughts inside me. I thought about the way my wife had spoken, her honesty, the vulnerability in her voice, the quiet courage it must have taken to admit feelings she hadn't fully explored herself. I felt a subtle ache, a mixture of longing, admiration, and the realization that love isn't always immediate or simple. It often moves in pauses, in silences, in tiny gestures that speak louder than words. I considered our son, his laughter, his innocence, and how his question had unintentionally stirred something profound between the adults in the house. Life had a way of revealing layers slowly, like sunlight filtering through leaves, and I recognized that the depth of my feelings for my wife had grown quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the shadows of ordinary moments. Sitting on a bench, I let myself feel the complexity of it all, the anticipation, the worry, the subtle romantic tension, and the overwhelming desire to protect the trust and intimacy we had built. I understood that love wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It was about patience, presence, and the willingness to navigate uncertainty together. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything with a golden glow, I realized that the answers wouldn't come all at once. But in this quiet reflection, I felt a growing certainty that whatever challenges or unspoken questions remained, our connection, the subtle touches, the lingering glances, the honesty we shared, would guide us forward. And for the first time that day, I felt a soft, steady reassurance settle in my chest, that we were navigating this together, one delicate moment at a time. That evening, the house felt different, softer somehow, as if the sunlight lingering through the curtains had a gentler hue, and the hum of the refrigerator and distant street sounds were less like background noise and more like a calming rhythm. Our son was quietly playing with his blocks in the living room, absorbed in stacking and knocking them over with the carefree focus only a 4-year-old can have. I glanced at my wife, who was sitting on the sofa with a book in her lap, though her attention seemed elsewhere. Her eyes were distant, thoughtful, yet there was an openness about her posture, a quiet invitation to bridge the gap that had formed between us that morning. I sat beside her, careful not to rush, careful not to overwhelm the fragile balance of vulnerability that now hung between us. "Can we talk again?" I asked softly, my hand resting near hers on the sofa, close enough for her to feel my presence without pressure. Her gaze lifted slowly to mine, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, a mix of relief and cautious hope shining in her eyes. We began to speak, slowly, tentatively. She told me about the funny uncle my son had mentioned, the friend from her past whose presence had been light-hearted, warm, and significant in small, unspoken ways. She explained the context, carefully choosing words that conveyed honesty without creating misunderstandings. She admitted that hearing our son mention him had stirred unexpected emotions, nostalgia, curiosity, even a gentle ache for a time she hadn't realized she still remembered vividly. I listened, not with judgment, not with fear, but with empathy and patience. I watched her hands, how they rested on her lap, how they occasionally twined with the hem of her sweater, subtle signs of her nervousness and vulnerability. I noticed the gentle way her eyes softened when she spoke, the small breaths she took as she allowed herself to share feelings she had tucked away. It was as if each word peeled back a layer of caution, and I felt honored to witness it, to be trusted with her truth. At one point, our hands brushed as she shifted slightly, and the simple contact sent a warmth through me that had nothing to do with the romantic tension of the morning and everything to do with connection, trust, and understanding. We paused, letting silence fill the room, a quiet acknowledgement that words were not always necessary. In that moment, the subtle tension that had hung over us, curiosity, concern, unspoken questions, began to dissolve, replaced by the comforting weight of shared vulnerability. By the time our son wandered over, holding a block triumphantly, the space between us had softened. The morning's unease hadn't vanished entirely, but it had transformed into something richer, understanding, empathy, and a quiet intimacy that needed no grand gestures to be felt. We smiled at each other, lingering in the warmth of our connection, knowing that while challenges might arise, we could face them together, grounded in trust and the gentle rhythm of our shared life. Even in silence, our hearts spoke. A slow-burn trust had been rekindled, and the quiet bond between us, strengthened by honesty, hinted at a deeper closeness, an intimacy built not from dramatic declarations, but from patience, listening, and the courage to be vulnerable. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over our quiet neighborhood, spilling golden light through the curtains and onto the breakfast table. There was a softness in the air, a warmth that felt different from the usual routine. Our son sat in his high chair, humming happily as he scooped cereal into his tiny mouth, crumbs scattering across the table, utterly absorbed in his morning ritual. The world outside seemed to mirror the gentle ease inside the house, birds chirping, a soft breeze rustling leaves, the faint scent of fresh flowers drifting in from the garden. I watched my wife as she poured milk into our son's bowl, her movements graceful and unhurried. There was a lightness in her posture, a quiet ease that hadn't been there the day before. She smiled at our son with genuine warmth, a softness in her eyes that reflected relief, trust, and a subtle acknowledgement of the conversation we had shared the evening before. That brief honesty, the willingness to open up, had shifted something between us, threading a quiet bond through the ordinary moments of our family life. I reached across the table to gently brush a stray curl from her face. The touch lingered just long enough to convey tenderness, affection, and reassurance, yet brief enough to feel like a natural part of the morning rather than a staged gesture. She looked at me, her gaze steady and calm, and in that glance, I felt the unspoken acknowledgement that we had navigated uncertainty together. The tension from the previous day had dissolved, replaced by a subtle warmth that didn't need words to be understood. Our son giggled as a piece of cereal fell onto the floor, and she leaned down to scoop it up, her laughter mingling with his in a melody that felt familiar and comforting. I realized then how delicate the balance of life could be, the way small moments, gentle touches, and honest conversations could heal the invisible frictions that sometimes creep into love and family. In that quiet, unassuming morning, the story of trust, patience, and emotional intimacy unfolded naturally. As we finished breakfast, she and I exchanged a lingering glance across the table. There was a quiet electricity in it, not dramatic, not urgent, but steady and reassuring. It spoke of understanding, connection, and the subtle depths of affection that grow slowly over time. The playful innocence of our son, his unaware curiosity, had sparked a chain of emotions that tested our patience, honesty, and empathy, and ultimately drew us closer, reinforcing the bond between us. When our son climbed onto my lap, wrapping his tiny arms around my neck, she rested her hand lightly on my shoulder. The gesture was effortless, unspoken, yet spoke volumes about the restored intimacy and trust between us. In the simple rhythm of our family morning, I recognized the power of subtle romance, the warmth of a glance, the gentle brush of a hand, the comfort of shared vulnerability. The day began fully, ordinary yet extraordinary in its quiet depth. There was no dramatic confession or sweeping declaration, just a steady understanding, an enduring connection, and the reassurance that, whatever challenges came our way, we were together. And as I looked at her, I felt that slow-burn love, the kind that grows quietly, patiently, and profoundly, touching every small moment of life and making the ordinary glow with meaning.